Our final panelist is Clay Lowery, who serves as the Vice President for Rock Creek Global Advisors, helping advise clients on international economic matters. He has more than 15 years in experience in the U.S. government, primarily the U.S. Treasury, where he rose from desk officer to Assistant Secretary for International Affairs, being involved in many of the international institutions that are having such a great effect on our economic situations at this time. So we'll turn the
Okay, thanks very much. Welcome to the Sequester. We're in it. So George actually stole a lot of my presentation. I wrote it for him, actually. So I will do my best to not try to be repetitive of some of the stuff he said, though I think the way he's laid it out and the framework he provided, I think is excellent. So I'm going to be talking to you about the U.S. fiscal situation, the federal budget crisis, as I called it, kind of through I'm going to do it in three parts. First is let's just look at the spending issues. George covered this pretty well, so I'm going to be a little quick on that. Second, what are the effects, what do we actually see in the long term of not fixing it? And third, what is the sequester? We've talked about it. It's covered in all the newspapers. The good thing for somebody like me is I don't have to use the word fiscal cliff anymore, but now I have to use the word sequester all the time. So let me just go forward. All right, so this is kind of rough. The numbers that I have are slightly off of George's, but I promise you they're all in the same bucket. It's interesting to look here. This is the total federal outlays. If you look, I'm going to use this little pointer. If you look, all right, so other mandatory, Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security, that's almost 60% of everything. And then interest is not something you can move around. So really what we're all trying to attack right now is the discretionary spending. But there's not that much there. I mean, let's go back. It's really 36% of total spending is in the defense and the non-defense discretionary. And what is the discretionary and mandatory? Mandatory is it's baked into the system, it's happening, unless we change the laws. Discretionary means you're supposed to do an annual appropriation every year based on a budget. Now, Congress has the problems getting budgets passed, but that's basically what this is. As over time, I think this is an interesting chart as well, you see what's happening to defense spending, which everybody always thinks, okay, the Defense Department spends too much money and so forth. But if you look at it, over time, the defense spending has declined fairly dramatically as a percentage of total spending. This less caps in the sequester, what that means is basically, this is what, the red line is what defense spending was looking like. There was in 2011, we put caps on spending going forward, which I'll get into in a little bit. And then the sequester, which we've been talking about a lot in the press, is this line, this purple line down here. So you can see defense takes a hit. It's not humongous, but it's pretty significant. But the really scary thing is taking a look at what's happening with all of the entitlement programs over time, where they're becoming a greater and greater portion of our budget. I put this up here, there's no, just to show you, this is our federal revenue. I think it's interesting only in that all the discussion that we had in the fiscal cliff was about income tax increases, the Bush tax cuts, if you will, and whether unloading them. One of the interesting things is how big payroll tax is actually part of it. And that actually increased in the January deal. And if anything, you're probably seeing that effect on consumption more than anything else, because basically every single person in the United States who gets a paycheck, all of a sudden they saw their taxes go up even just slightly. So now this is kind of the second part, which is, so what does this really mean over time? So these are the difference between the spending and the taxes is what we call a deficit. All right, so just to recap, this is where we had the surpluses at the end of the Clinton administration. You see it start to blow out here during the Bush administration and then to start coming back together. So right here, I think if you talk to some people within the Bush administration, they would say, look, we were starting to get things back together again. And then wham, and that wham is the financial crisis. So you see taxes dropped dramatically, spending went way up as we did the bailouts of the banking system, as we did the stimuluses, et cetera. Things have started to come back down as all of these things have been unwinding and as taxes come back and the economy's recovered. But I think what is scary, to use George's word, is look in the out years. I mean, as you keep going forward, and this is off of President Obama's 2013 budget, the spending continues to climb and decline and decline. I think a lot of that is because of entitlements. And even with a fairly high tax rate and high tax collection, we're nowhere near closing this deficit. So I think the point I'm trying to make is it could get a little spooky out there. This graph is actually maybe even more frightening if you look at it from a debt to GDP stage. All right, so President Obama's budget gives you this debt to GDP path, which is not a good path. And I know what the president's budget now today would say is, I'm going to try to get you a path that's closer to the way my red line's going now. So off of this a little bit. The Ryan budget, which we've heard about when Paul Ryan was in Congress before he was running for when he was vice presidential candidate, you can see kind of drops down pretty quickly. The Bowles-Simpson plan, for those of you who don't know, this was a presidential commission that Barack Obama set up, bipartisan, came up with actually what most people thought was a really interesting, fascinating plan, had some bipartisan buy-in, however, never received the buy-in from Barack Obama, or for that matter, Paul Ryan. That actually put us on a path that at least you could see your debt to GDP starting to really fall. This number is the most interesting because, so that's this Congressional Budget Office, which is sort of the scorekeeper in Washington. They basically are saying realistic to them means that Washington can't get anything done. That's realistic, which I actually think there is some realism to that. And if anybody's interested, I can tell you what goes into these numbers. As you can see, it goes out of this world. All right. So now, what is the sequester? The sequester comes out of the August 2011 debt deal. So the August 2011 debt deal, for those of you who don't remember, was there was a crisis between Congress and the presidency, which, by the way, seems to be happening every other week. But there was a crisis at that time about whether or not we should raise the debt ceiling. Now, I think, and I am a Republican, but I think the Republicans were a bunch of morons on this issue. I mean, they should have not. Playing around with the debt ceiling is just bad for our economy and it's bad for the markets. But they did. And so, but then they did strike a deal. And the deal was basically we will increase the debt ceiling by $2.1 trillion. And in exchange, we were going to require $2.1 trillion in cuts over 10 years. How is that done? The first way it's done is we put in this $917 billion in cuts. Now that basically means that you're going to put a cap at a lower rate than otherwise would have been the case on discretionary spending. So if you remember a few charts back where I had the defense line, and I have one line and a second line and then the sequester line, that second line is that cap that I was talking about. The second thing was we're going to get another $1.2 trillion in cuts, and we're going to do that through this super committee that we're creating. If that super committee fails in its work, then we're going to have a sequester. Obviously, the super committee failed, so we got a sequester. The sequester basically does the following. It cuts equally between defense and non-defense spending. It exempts big programs like Social Security, Medicaid, Veterans Benefits, the Earned Income Tax Credit, and a lot of other programs. It does Medicare. Medicare was the only mandatory spending it did, though that cut is at 2%, is a 2% cut. All in, $1.2 trillion. So here's what's interesting about this thing. So here's defense, 42% of the overall cuts, again, over 10 years. But remember that defense is only 19% of current spending levels, by the way, which is going down. So you're basically really heavy on defense. And the idea there was that would scare a lot of Republicans into not allowing the sequester to take place. That obviously might not work. This non-discretionary defense, 27%. Remember, the number was around 17% of all of our spending is non-discretionary spending. In other words, we're continuing to squeeze blood out of the stone that we can't squeeze much more. We're not squeezing blood out of, and George put this better than I did, out of the big kahuna, which is entitlements. So here, basically, this 15% comes out of entitlements. And remember, that 15% of the cuts is actually 60% of our spending. There have been some replacement ideas. President Obama is a better way of putting that, this is his idea. So that $1.2 trillion would become $1.8 trillion in his budget. You can see he's much kinder on defense. Unlike what some Republicans have said, he does try to get at some of the mandatory spending, like this chain CPI is basically an effect on Social Security. Obviously, there's something the Republicans don't like. He is asking for more tax revenues. If you look at the House Republican replacement, so the Republicans did actually put forward a couple different bills that passed the House to try to deal with the sequester. They have also another $1.8 trillion. It's not as specified because of the nature of the way it did in Congress, but the main thing to put in here is it replaces the defense cuts with non-defense cuts, which is based on discretionary spending, as well as some mandatory spending. Obviously, as you can possibly imagine, no tax increases. And then finally, this is Bowles-Simpson. What they did about 2 weeks ago is they said, let's update our plan. What we think is going to be necessary in order to not just stabilize the debt over time, but to get the debt on a declining path, is to basically do $2.4 trillion. You can see they do hit on things like Medicare. They do hit on revenue. So they obviously tried to come up with what they thought would be more of a centrist solution, and no one's paying attention to them. What is the actual economic impact of the sequester? Okay, if you looked over the last week, you would think that maybe Armageddon's going to happen. I mean, where we're going to take food out of the mouths of babes and kick grandmothers out on the street. Probably not going to happen that way. In fact, I think even the president today said this is not apocalyptic. It is basically just a stupid way of doing business. Totally agree with that. Oops, sorry, I messed up. The economic impact of the sequester is an interesting thing. So this number is basically no sequester. This is kind of a consensus forecast that the United States economy is going to grow 2% this year. With the sequester, you basically remove about a 0.5 percentage point of GDP. There's different estimates on that. And then here's what happens over time. Your fiscal deficit goes down, is going down in 2013 anyway. It goes down more with the sequester, not a lot more. You can see 850 billion versus 800 billion as a deficit number. Not exactly a huge difference. Debt to GDP over time does get affected. The sequester does bring your numbers down. This is an interesting thing to see why the sequester is not that huge a deal. So this is a group called the Bipartisan Policy Center. They put out, this is their fiscal path. They have a different numbers than the CBO just because of the different assumptions that they use. And they said, if you bring in the sequester, this is the difference over time. So it's not a huge thing over time, but it is something that could be significant. The last point I wanted to make was on the timeline that we have. So today is March 1st, happy Sequester Day. But what I think is going to happen over the next few weeks in Washington is there's going to be an argument over what's called the continuing resolution. For those that don't know, the continuing resolution is basically a way of our government funding itself. So right now, if we cannot come to an agreement over that continuing resolution, we have what is called a government shutdown. You would have to shut the government down, and non-essential employees would have to be laid off for a little while until you could get a budget that made sense. I'm not sure that's going to happen. I think that there will be a continuing resolution. The Republicans and Democrats will figure out a way to come together. The big question in that will be, what do they do with the sequester? So one of the reasons why there's not total panic by some people on the sequester, is that you can unwind what has been done on the sequester in that continuing resolution. I think the Republicans will say, I don't want to unwind it. I need those type of spending cuts. But then they could say, instead of it being done in sort of a ham-handed way, maybe we could do it in a more targeted way. At the same time, the Democrats will be trying to push for, maybe we do need some of those cuts, but we want to see some revenue increases in the meantime. So that's going to be played out over the next 3 to 4 weeks. What might be another scarier thing is, and not on a long-term basis, but a very short-term basis, is the debt ceiling. People have forgotten the debt ceiling will come up again. So right now it is kicked off until May 21st. At that point in time, the Treasury Department, which is where I used to work, will come up with what they would call extraordinary measures. Basically, they're borrowing from some pots of money and putting them to others. That buys you until probably the end of July, maybe early August. And at that point, we're back to where we were in August 2011. Do the Republicans say, I'm okay with raising the debt ceiling under certain circumstances, and the Democrats agree to those circumstances? Or do they say, I'll just do it in a clean way? Or do they say, I'm shutting it down unless we get even more spending cuts? And of course, Democrats would say, well, only if there's some more tax revenues. So I'm not convinced. I mean, right now, a lot of people are not paying attention to the debt ceiling, mainly because it's a few months off. But don't be surprised if we're not basically creating another crisis 3 months from now or 4 months from now, as we're doing this month. Thank you. Those are the positive, optimistic scenario from my side.